I grew up in the heart of Manchester, surrounded by city life throughout my childhood and teenage years. One day, I happened to watch one of those reality survival shows, the kind where they drop a washed-up actor into the wilderness and see if they can hack it. It got me thinking, if I were in a survival situation, would I manage, or would I crumble and starve, clueless and helpless without a supermarket to grab an overpriced sandwich? I tried to get my friends on board with a camping trip, but they all thought I had lost the plot. At first, they pictured a cozy campsite with a nearby pub, but when I explained that I was planning something a bit more rugged, they bailed one by one. I had already read online about people going solo camping, so I knew it was a thing. The only question was whether I had the guts to do it. So, I bit the bullet and set off alone to test myself. Turns out I was tougher than I expected. I didn't exactly thrive during my first trip in Brecon Beacons, but I didn't die either, and to my surprise, I actually enjoyed it. I'm not going to spew all the cliches about becoming one with nature or finding beauty in its harshness, though those things are true. For me, the biggest takeaway was how small my everyday worries seemed in comparison. A long queue at the bar for a pint and a packet of crisps? At least you're warm and dry. A slow pizza delivery? At least hot food is on its way. The trip gave me perspective, and honestly, it did wonders for my mental health. Plus, I learned some actual survival skills. When I got back, my friends assumed I'd say, "Never again, lads. That was miserable." But to their surprise, I told them I couldn't wait to go again. Over the next couple of years, I took 3 or 4 more solo trips to different forests. Then I decided to up the ante. My next destination? The Cairngorms in Scotland. The Cairngorms is one of the wildest places in Britain. It's not too hard to get to, a few hours drive, but once you're in the middle, it's a 2-day hike through brutal terrain to reach the nearest road, let alone civilization. When I first read about it, I knew it was the ultimate test. So, I booked time off work, scraped together enough money for the trip. It felt like taking out a small loan, though I'm joking, kind of, and headed to Scotland one damp October morning. I drove up to Avemore, a small town near the edge of the park, and spent the night at a budget-friendly lodge. The folks who ran the place thought I was crazy, not for wild camping, but for doing it alone. They reminded me that where I was headed, there'd be no phone signal and only one ranger station miles away. If I got injured, the odds of running into another person who could help were next to nothing. They warned me outright that my plan was reckless, but to me, that just made it more exciting. I had enough experience to handle myself, so after a good night's sleep in a real bed, I set off. I always got a buzz from my camping trips, but this time, there was an edge of fear. Being completely alone in the middle of nowhere makes you feel vulnerable. The UK doesn't have much in the way of dangerous wildlife, unlike North America, but there's still a primal sense of being pitted against nature. That feeling is even stronger at night. By the afternoon of my second day, while heading toward a place marked on my map as Silver Glen, it really hit me just how isolated I was. October isn't peak hiking season, so by then, I was probably a full day's walk from seeing another soul. That kind of solitude was unsettling, but at the same time, it felt like absolute freedom. No rules, no schedules, just me and the wilderness. It almost felt post-apocalyptic, like I was the last person on Earth. The Cairngorms' rugged landscape only added to that eerie, deserted feeling. As evening crept in, I searched for a campsite. The terrain was mostly open grassland with scattered rocks. No trees in sight. I needed tree cover for shelter and firewood, so I checked my map. It showed a dense woodland past a long ridge, at the base of a peak called Creek Dub. Climbing it looked exhausting, but I had no choice unless I wanted to sleep exposed. So I trudged up. When I reached the top, I took a break. I was carrying everything on my back: food, water, shelter, tools, spare clothes, and my shoulders were killing me. From up there, I could see miles of barren land in every direction. No people, no vehicles, no roads. Unlike England's countryside, where even remote spots have winding lanes and cottages, this place was truly untouched. Felt like stepping back in time. After a moment's rest, I pressed on and finally reached the trees. I set up my shelter, a simple poncho strung between 2 trunks, started a fire, and made dinner. By the time I finished eating, I had just enough daylight left to collect firewood and make a cup of cocoa before bed. As an experiment, I left the cup near the fire to see if the embers would keep it warm. The second night's sleep is always better than the first. The first night, your brain resists the unfamiliarity of sleeping outdoors. The second, exhaustion takes over. When I woke up, I felt more rested. As I tied my boots, I remembered my cup. But when I glanced toward the fire pit, the cup was gone. I frowned, still groggy, and scanned the area. Then I saw it, sitting neatly on a fallen log, perfectly balanced. At first I thought, did I move it and forget? But then I looked inside. The cocoa was gone, and in its place was a single blade of grass, tied with small, careful knots. Someone had been at my campsite while I slept. In an instant, my relaxed morning turned to dread. My heart pounded as I shot up, knife in hand, scanning the trees. I couldn't see anyone, but my instincts screamed that I wasn't alone. Had someone been sitting there, watching me sleep? Was this their way of letting me know? Some might think, so what? Someone moved your cup. It's just a prank. But that's the point. If they meant no harm, why do it at all? They could have just left me alone. The message was clear. I could have done anything I wanted to you. I packed up as fast as I could. I was a day and a half's walk from the nearest road, but I wasn't staying another night. I hiked nonstop for 13 hours, only pausing for water and to check if I was being followed. Each time I looked back, nothing, just empty wilderness. Yet the feeling of being watched never left me. Even now, I don't know who it was. Maybe another camper who spotted my shelter and decided to play a joke. But I never saw smoke from another fire, no footprints, no gear, nothing. Whoever it was moved silently, unseen. And the thought that they might have been out there watching me the entire time, that's what truly unsettled me. We're going back nearly 2 decades for this one. Talk about a blast from the past. Back in late October of 2004, I went on a camping trip with my then boyfriend and 3 of his friends. At first, I was hesitant to go since I'd be the only girl in a group of 4 guys. Even though I had met my boyfriend's friends before, I worried it might be awkward being the only woman there for 3 nights. I also, call me skeptical, wasn't totally convinced my boyfriend and his friends would pick a decent campsite or do anything besides sitting around a fire, grilling food, and drinking. But I was totally wrong on both counts. While there was plenty of grilling and sitting around, the spot they picked was absolutely breathtaking. And, for the most part, they were all perfect gentlemen. It turned out that 2 of his friends were serious about hiking and camping, so they wouldn't just throw up a tent anywhere. The site they picked was stunning. I'm not exaggerating, it was humbling. A short trail led to a waterfall, so we had clean water for drinking and washing. On top of that, the campsite was near several trailheads, so we could choose an easy, medium, or tough hike depending on how we felt in the morning. It was the best of both worlds, beautiful and practical. The guys were fun, polite, and respectful of my space. Most importantly, they didn't make crude jokes about me and my boyfriend in the tent, which was a relief. Not that anything happened. We were outdoors, and that's just gross. Since it was late October, the trails were nearly empty, which suited me just fine. It meant I had the waterfall all to myself to wash up after our hikes. The next day, we had the trails to ourselves. No one drank too much the night before, so we were fresh and ready to go. After a full day of hiking, we cooked some more, had a few drinks, and then called it a night. As I climbed into my sleeping bag, I told my boyfriend, "Thanks for inviting me. This was way better than I expected." He laughed, saying he had told me not to worry. And honestly, he was right. The trip had been perfect. Until the next morning when everything changed. To explain what happened next, I need to go back a little. Just before bed, my boyfriend asked me to put the cooler and speaker in his truck while he put out the fire and gathered trash. I did what he asked and then placed his truck keys in the front pocket of his backpack, which was at the farthest end of our tent, away from the entrance. Our sleeping arrangement had him closest to the tent flap, and he had a firearm with him in case anything went wrong. That night, none of us heard a thing. We all slept soundly, But when we unzipped the tent the next morning, our perfect campsite was in ruins. The fire pit was wrecked, with rocks scattered across the site. My boyfriend's truck doors were wide open. The speaker was smashed against a tree. The cooler was emptied, with raw meat thrown all over the place. We just sat there, silent, poking our heads out of the tent in total disbelief. The peaceful quiet of the forest didn't feel so peaceful anymore. Felt wrong. As we climbed out of the tents, we tried to make sense of what happened. More importantly, we couldn't figure out how everything had been destroyed without a single one of us waking up. What started as a confused discussion quickly turned into accusations. My boyfriend blamed me for not locking the truck, which made me furious. "Do you think I'm stupid?" I shot back. I clearly remembered locking the truck and putting the keys in his bag. I was sure of it, but when he checked his bag, the keys weren't there. That's when my stomach dropped. He snapped at me, demanding an apology, but I was too shaken. I felt dizzy, like I was losing my mind. Desperate to prove myself, I retraced my steps and found the keys on the ground near the open truck doors. I kept stammering, unable to form words. My boyfriend must have sensed something was off because he suddenly went quiet and just said he wanted to leave. After apologizing to his friends, we threw our things in the truck and got out of there fast. The drive home felt surreal. I kept repeating that I knew I had locked the truck, but my boyfriend just stayed quiet. When I started crying, he finally spoke. "I believe you," he said. "I'm sorry, but that didn't make me feel any better." It didn't answer the real question. What the hell happened that night? I kept pressing him for an explanation. He had way more camping experience than I did, so if anyone would know, it was him or his friends. But all he said was, "I don't know," over and over again. Eventually, we pulled into a diner parking lot to calm down and talk. I could tell he was struggling to find the right words. Finally, he admitted he'd had a strange dream the night before. Not a full nightmare, but unsettling enough to wake him up. He told me that, in his dream, he woke up in the tent with me beside him. But then he noticed someone crouching over him, standing with one foot on either side of his sleeping bag. He said the person's face looked unnatural, like it was made of stretched out ski mask fabric, not like they were wearing one. That's when he realized it was a dream and forced himself awake. At first, I was frustrated. I had been expecting him to tell me something useful, not a creepy dream. But then I realized his dream lined up with what happened. What if it wasn't just a dream? He refused to talk more about it after that. He went inside, got us coffee, and we drove the rest of the way in silence. I thought we'd talk about it later, but when I called him that evening, he shut me down completely. He said he and his friends had agreed to just move on. No reporting it, no discussing it. Couldn't believe it. Even more shocking, my boyfriend, who was obsessive about his truck and insurance, refused to file a report. I thought surely that would be the thing that pushed him to go to the police. But it wasn't. I have my own theory. I think it was my boyfriend who trashed our campsite. I don't know if you'd call it a blackout or something else, but I think he did more than just wake up from a bad dream. I think deep down he knows it too, but accepting that possibility was too terrifying for him. So instead, he buried it. He didn't want me talking to his friends about it because he knew we might put the pieces together. We broke up less than a year later. I won't say this was the main reason, but it definitely played a part. One of the last things I told him was that if he ever wanted to seek help, I'd support him. But I don't think he ever did. I can't say for sure what happened that night. It's just a theory. But the thing that convinces me I might be right, as far as I know, he never went camping again. I came across your channel a few weeks ago and noticed you take story submissions. This is the scariest true story I know, and I am 100% certain it happened. Almost exactly 6 years ago, my best friend's father went on a camping trip in the Yukon, Canada, to a remote place called Silver Lake. To anyone unfamiliar, that might not sound like a big deal, but if you knew my friend's dad, you'd understand how strange and completely out of character it was. He left for the Yukon in September, saying he'd be back in just a couple of weeks. The strange part? He hadn't been camping since he was a kid. He absolutely hated outdoor activities. He was the kind of guy who preferred staying inside, tinkering with electronics and watching TV. Then, out of nowhere, he developed this sudden fascination with camping. He went out, bought a bunch of gear, and just like that, he announced that he was heading out on a solo trip. Another odd thing was that he brought the family's 2 dogs with him. This was particularly weird because he couldn't stand those dogs. The only reason the family even had them was because his wife and kids had begged him for years. He never walked them, never cleaned up after them. He barely tolerated them being in the same room as him. But then, just as suddenly as he took an interest in camping, he decided he needed to bond with the dogs and take them on an adventure. His family started to worry that he was having some kind of midlife crisis, but what could they do? They figured they'd let him go and talk to him about his strange new behavior once he got back. But then he didn't come back. In fact, he never returned at all. When he missed his return date, my friend's family reported him missing. The police sent out a search team to check around Silver Lake, but as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, there was no sign of him anywhere. No one wanted to accept the worst, especially not my friend or his family, but by the time March rolled around, he had been gone for over 5 months. The harsh winter made survival seem nearly impossible, especially given his lack of experience in the wild. Then, in early April, a pilot flying over the area spotted a man and 2 dogs walking near the lake. The pilot wasn't part of any official search team, but he must have known about the missing person case because he reported it immediately. The authorities, along with a search and rescue team, were sent to investigate, and within a day, they located his campsite. They found collapsed tent poles, a container of boat sealant, a tent, and some dog supplies, but no sign of the man himself. The boat sealant was another oddity because it suggested he had a canoe with him. My friend's dad had never expressed any interest in canoeing, had no experience with it, and as far as anyone knew, hadn't bought one before leaving for the Yukon. After further searching, the police told my friend's family they believed his father had made his way to Whitehorse, the biggest town in the Yukon. They had searched the Silver Lake area thoroughly and found no further clues, so they expanded their efforts to places like Whitehorse and even as far as Fort St. John, where an old college friend of his lived. Maybe he had stopped by for a visit, but there was no evidence he had ever arrived. The old friend swore he hadn't seen him, and unless he was lying to cover for him, it seemed to be the truth. So, if he never went there, then where did he go? Where is he now? It's a hard thing to admit, but at this point, most people believe he's no longer alive. He went from complaining about having to walk the dogs to suddenly embracing outdoor survival and canoeing. If he hadn't been secretly training himself in wilderness survival, which seems unlikely, then he was probably in way over his head and didn't realize it until it was too late. One of the things the authorities told my friend's family was that even in the summer, the lakes and rivers in that region stay dangerously cold. Even if it looked like a good day to go out on the water in April, falling in without help nearby could mean you never make it out. They also said that wild animals might have gotten to his remains, which would explain why no trace of him has been found, except for his belongings. But here's the thing, if an animal attack is the explanation, then why hasn't his canoe ever been found? I don't care how hungry a bear gets. They don't eat entire canoes. A brightly colored canoe would be much easier to locate. I get that the search teams have a massive area to cover, but it's been nearly 6 years now, minus 2020 when search efforts were limited due to, well, despite all that time, they haven't found a single additional clue beyond his abandoned campsite. Usually, search and rescue teams recover some evidence, bones, scraps of clothing, pieces of equipment, something. But in this case, there has been absolutely nothing. Some say that fresh snowfall might have hidden his canoe, making it harder to find. But the more time passes, the more it feels like he just vanished into thin air. If this whole thing haunts me as much as it does, I can't even begin to imagine what my friend and his family must be going through. They try to stay strong, but I know the pain is still there. They do anything for answers, for some kind of closure. But for now, all they can do is wait and hope that someday, they'll finally know the truth. I was deep in the wilderness of Oregon, spending several days hiking through the national forests. By then, I was already about 22 miles away from the closest road, and for the first 2 days I hadn't seen another person. It was early autumn, and the chill in the air likely kept most people away, but I had all the necessary gear to handle it. That morning, I woke up, brewed some coffee over my small camping stove, and packed up for the next stretch of my hike. My next campsite was about 6 miles ahead, which is a pretty long trek through mountainous terrain. About 4 hours into my hike, I suddenly heard footsteps approaching from ahead. When I looked up, I saw a man walking toward me on the trail. I hadn't expected to run into anyone, but I gave him a polite nod as he passed. That's when I noticed something odd. He didn't have a backpack, no water, nothing at all. He was just wearing a long-sleeved shirt and some worn-out hiking pants. The whole thing seemed strange, so I glanced back at him once he passed. At that exact moment, he turned his head and looked back at me too. Not wanting to make it awkward, I quickly faced forward and continued my hike. After some time, I brushed it off. I figured he must have had a campsite nearby and was just out for a walk. But deep down, I knew that there weren't any designated campsites in that area. Either way, I didn't dwell on it too much. The next few hours were tough, but eventually, I reached my campsite. It was completely empty, just a small patch of ground where I could set up my tent. I had expected a better view, but instead, the place was surrounded by trees, making it feel more like I was in the middle of a dense forest rather than on a mountainside. Still, I was exhausted, so I focused on setting up my tent and then sat down to watch the sunset. That's when I heard it, a rustling sound behind me. I turned and felt my stomach drop. It was the same man from before. He still didn't have a pack or any supplies, and now I was even more confused about how he ended up here. He had been walking the opposite direction earlier, so he must have turned around shortly after passing me. He didn't acknowledge me at all. Instead, he walked to the other side of the small clearing and sat down. No tent, no sleeping bag, just sitting there on the dirt, staring into the woods. He was only about 15 feet away, but since he wasn't looking at me, I was able to get a better look at him. He seemed to be in his late 30s, had short brown hair, and a scruffy beard. Something about the whole situation felt deeply unsettling. The sun was setting, and with every passing minute, I felt more and more unsafe. Who was this guy? Why was he this deep in the forest with no supplies? No food, no water, nothing. About half an hour passed, and he still hadn't moved. I knew I couldn't stay there. I didn't have another campsite to go to, but I figured I could find a random spot further away and just make sure he didn't follow me. As I started packing up my tent, that's when he finally looked at me. He didn't look away. Every time I glanced up, his eyes were locked on me. The moment I had everything packed into my bag, I noticed him standing up out of the corner of my eye. My heart started pounding as I turned and walked away as fast as I could. I could hear his footsteps behind me. He was following me. I gripped the small knife in my pocket, unsure of what was about to happen. I glanced back a few times. He was still behind me, but little by little, he was falling farther away. That's when I decided to take a risk. I suddenly stepped off the trail and into the woods. By now, it was completely dark. I prayed he hadn't seen me leave the path. I crouched behind a tree, trying to control my breathing. About 30 seconds later, I heard his footsteps reach the spot where I left the trail, but instead of continuing forward, he stopped. I held my breath, watching his shadowy figure in the darkness. He turned his head, scanning the trees like he knew I had gone off the path. Then he started shouting. His voice was upbeat, like he was trying to sound friendly. That only made it more unsettling. After a couple of minutes, he stopped calling out, but instead of heading back the way he came, he stepped off the trail too, heading into the trees on the other side. I stayed hidden, frozen in place, as the forest around me went silent. I must have waited there for over an hour before I finally found the courage to move. I forced myself to keep walking and didn't stop at the next campsite. I just kept going until I was completely out of the woods. When I got back to town, I went straight to the local police and filed a report. They never followed up. I still don't know what that man was doing out there or what his intentions were. Maybe he lived in the woods. Maybe he was looking for someone to rob or worse. Whatever the case, I'm just grateful I got away. My girlfriend has a story from when she was in her early 20s. Since she's not much of a storyteller and isn't interested in writing it down, I asked her if I could share it. She grew up in Rochester, New York, and went to college at Fordham University. One October, when she realized she had a few days off, she decided to drive back to Rochester to go camping with some friends. She and 4 of her friends, all around 19 or 20 years old, drove out to a campsite that had cabins, fire pits, and picnic benches. As they were unloading their stuff, they noticed they had some neighbors, for guys who were around the same age. They got to chatting, and eventually one of the guys asked if they'd be down to share some beers later in the evening. After both groups had eaten and settled in, my girlfriend and her friends agreed. As the night went on, things got wilder, but everyone was having a great time getting to know each other. Then, at some point, one of the guys went into his cabin and came back out holding a gun, saying it belonged to his dad. He was waving it around like an idiot, and everyone immediately started telling him to put it away. There's no worse idea than messing with a gun while drunk. The guy just laughed it off, saying they were overreacting and that the gun wasn't even loaded. To prove it, he pointed it at the sky and pulled the trigger 2 or 3 times. Nothing happened, but even though no shots were fired, nobody was comfortable with him waving it around. They kept telling him to put it away and get some rest because he was way too drunk and acting ridiculous. For some reason, the guy took major offense to that. After proving the first 2 chambers were empty, he suddenly put the gun to his own head and pulled the trigger. At this point, almost everyone can already guess what happened next. And 99.9% of the time, they're exactly right. That 3rd chamber? It had a bullet in it. No one knows how it got there, whether he loaded it and forgot, if someone else had touched it, or if he just never checked properly before bringing it along. But none of that mattered. Right then and there, he shot himself in the head in front of everyone. As you can imagine, the scene instantly became absolute chaos. But my girlfriend says what stuck with her the most wasn't just the horror of what happened. It was the screaming and sobbing. She and another girl immediately focused on giving him first aid and trying to direct 911 to their cabin. But in her heart, my girlfriend knew there was no saving him. The other girl was technically performing first aid, but it was more for show, to keep everyone from completely losing it. She said it took around half an hour for the cops and paramedics to arrive, and by that time, the mood was beyond shattered. One of the guys was in total shock. He just sat there, not speaking or reacting. Another friend of hers wouldn't stop crying. And it wasn't just crying, it was full-on, uncontrollable sobbing. Every time she seemed to calm down, she'd replay the moment in her head and start all over again. For a long time afterward, my girlfriend and her friends all showed signs of what the doctors called acute stress disorder. From what I understand, it's similar to PTSD, except it only becomes full PTSD if the symptoms last more than a few months. Thankfully, 3 of the 4 girls, including my girlfriend, recovered after a few weeks. But the girl who had been crying nonstop, she was on medication for PTSD for years. Even today, she says that night ruined her life. It also completely changed how she feels about guns. My girlfriend and I still have slightly different perspectives. I'm a gun owner myself and I support the right to own them. But that night made me see a serious gray area when it comes to who should have access to firearms. A responsible person having a gun can be a good thing, but when a weapon ends up in the hands of a reckless, drunk idiot, something that should make me feel safe suddenly becomes the most terrifying thing in the world. This happened a little over 2 years ago. My name is Ryan, and before this, I had absolutely no experience with camping. I really wanted to get into it, though, and figured the only way to start was to actually go out and try. So, this was my very first camping trip. I picked a campground about 2 hours away from my town. It seemed like a good balance, not too crowded, but also not completely deserted, which I thought was ideal for my first time. I drove out there and reached the trailhead around midday, then hiked for a few more hours before arriving at the campsite. The area had a few picnic tables and some built-in barbecue grills scattered around. There were also a couple of small trails branching off, leading to more secluded camping spots where a few other people had already pitched their tents. I walked down one of these paths, put my gear down, and spent the next hour making sure my tent was properly set up and everything was in order. By then, a small group of campers had gathered around the central area, chatting while using the grills. I'm not the most outgoing person, so I didn't feel comfortable joining in on my own. But about half an hour later, a guy walked over to my spot and invited me to hang out with them. It was a nice gesture, and he seemed friendly enough, so I decided to join them. I followed him over and met some of the other campers. Everyone seemed cool, so I stayed for about an hour before people started heading back to their tents. I said goodnight and went back to my own tent as well. It was probably around 7 p.m., about an hour before sunset, when the guy from earlier, Kevin, showed up again at my tent. He was about my age, maybe mid to late 20s. When he came over, he asked if I had ever been to this area before. I told him no, and then he asked if I knew about a lake nearby. I said no again, and he immediately started talking about this amazing hidden lake that hardly anyone knew about. He said it was a really cool spot and that he was heading there if I wanted to come along. It seemed like another friendly gesture, and honestly, I was curious. I quickly put my things inside my tent and left everything there before following him. He said it was about a 10-minute walk through the woods, so we had plenty of time before the sun went down. We took a narrow path through the trees. It wasn't a proper trail, but it looked like it had been used a few times before. However, after 10 minutes of walking, there was still no sign of a lake. Kevin, who had been really talkative before, suddenly got very quiet. He was now giving short, one-word answers, and he kept glancing at the sunset. While he could have just been checking how much daylight we had left, something about it made me feel like he was actually waiting for it to get dark. After 20 minutes of walking, I started putting some distance between us. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I could feel my adrenaline kicking in. The sun was now just barely shining thin beams of light through the trees, and the forest felt eerily silent all of a sudden. When I saw a chance, I turned and tried to quietly retrace my steps back to camp. But Kevin noticed immediately. At first, he called out to me in a friendly tone, still keeping up the act. But when I didn't stop, his voice quickly turned to angry shouting, and I could hear him running after me. For about a minute, he was yelling and chasing me through the woods. Then, I heard his footsteps start to slow down, right before a loud metallic sound rang out behind me. I glanced back for a second and saw what looked like a knife bouncing off a tree just a few feet away. It seemed like a last-ditch attempt to stop me. After that, I lost him. I ran back to the main campsite and tried to explain what had just happened. One of the other campers called the police. Kevin, or whatever his real name was, never returned. In fact, the others said he had already been at the campsite when they arrived earlier in the day, and after checking around, he didn't even have a tent anywhere. Looking back, I think he targeted me because I was alone and clearly inexperienced with camping. Thankfully, I didn't have to find out what he really had planned for that night, because if I had, I probably wouldn't be here to tell this story. Last year, I spent a couple of weeks in Wyoming. I had a camper set up in the back of my pickup, so I usually parked at campgrounds or anywhere public land was available. This was one of my final days, so I needed to start heading back the way I came. Unfortunately, my truck had some issues that day, and fixing it took most of my time. By the time the sun was setting, I had barely made any progress on my drive. I grabbed a coffee from a small gas station and decided I'd push through for at least another 2 hours before finding a place to camp for the night. As I drove, the road cleared out, and I was practically alone. I used an app to locate the closest camping spot and found one just off the road on public land. When I reached the turnoff, it was a narrow dirt trail stretching about a quarter-mile into the trees. At the end, there was a small grassy clearing surrounded by forest, completely empty. I parked at the edge of the clearing, facing the exit, then went into the camper. It was probably close to midnight, and I was just about to drift off to sleep. But barely a minute later, I saw a faint glow creeping through the edges of the privacy screen covering my window. I sat up and carefully lifted the corner, just enough to peek outside. A pair of headlights were coming down the path toward me. As they approached, they slowed to a stop. It seemed like whoever was driving noticed my truck and didn't want to camp in the same spot. but instead of turning around, they just sat there at the entrance to the clearing. I could make out an old, beat-up truck, rust covering the front bumper, but the headlights were too bright to see much else. Since they were still on the path, their truck was facing mine, completely blocking my only way out. Something about the situation felt off. It was just a gut instinct, but after a few minutes of them sitting there, I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep here. I quickly folded up my bed and got up, but just as I was about to leave the camper, I heard one of their doors open. I glanced back out the window. Their headlights were off now, and two men stood outside in the darkness. They started walking toward my camper, and I could barely make out the shape of something in their hands. My stomach dropped. I let the privacy screen fall back into place and listened as their footsteps crunched against the ground. They were trying to be quiet, slowly circling my truck, until they suddenly stopped. It was as if they somehow realized I was awake. "Hey, can you help us out? We're just looking for some directions," one of them called. His voice was off, slurred, like he'd been drinking. I didn't answer. I took another peek through a different window and saw one of them standing close to my truck, gripping something, some kind of metal tool, maybe a crowbar or a hammer. That was all the confirmation I needed, but I was stuck. There was no way to leave without stepping out of the camper and into my truck. One of them walked up to the camper door, dragging something against it and pressing against it like he was trying to pry it open. My heart was pounding, but for some reason, I was still trying to stay silent, as if they didn't already know I was inside. I braced my legs against the door, pushing back to keep it shut. Then, out of nowhere, a gunshot rang out. It wasn't from the two men. It came from somewhere deeper in the woods. Both men froze. Then, without a word, they turned and sprinted back to their truck. Within seconds, they were gone. I don't know who fired that shot, but I knew this was my chance to get out. I scrambled from the camper into the driver's seat, started the truck, and sped back onto the main road. An hour later, I pulled into a well-lit truck stop, finally letting myself breathe again. What really happened back there? I still don't know. Maybe some hunter or another camper had been nearby, saw what was going on, and fired a warning shot to scare them off. But considering how isolated I was, that seems almost too lucky to be true. Either way, if not for that shot, my truck and camper would probably be listed for sale on some random website right now, and I might not have been around to find out. My name is Lisa, and I'm from Boise, Idaho. I'm going to attempt to share a true, terrifying experience that happened to me during a solo camping trip last autumn. I know it might seem foolish for a young woman to camp alone in a state with a history of producing its fair share of dangerous criminals, but I always carry a firearm. I know it's not a perfect safeguard, but it gives me a sense of security just knowing I have a way to defend myself. So, it was last September when I made up my mind to head out to Mirror Lake. I needed some time to unwind, enjoy the quiet, and take in some beautiful scenery, but I didn't want the trails to be too strenuous. Mirror Lake seemed like the ideal spot. It's also one of the more frequented hiking areas near the Cascade Range, which I always considered a plus. Having other hikers or campers nearby could be useful in case of an emergency. I've never subscribed to the whole watch out for bears paranoia. To me, that screams, I don't hike often. The vast majority of people you meet on the trails are fantastic, way friendlier than the joggers or cyclists you encounter in the city. But, of course, there are always exceptions, and unfortunately, I found one that night. I hiked about 4 or 5 miles along the trail before setting up camp. I made sure to pitch my tent out of sight from the main path for privacy. I was pretty exhausted after the trek, so once I finished setting up my tent, unpacking the essentials, and making a small fire to warm up some food, I decided to turn in for the night around 9 p.m. I remember getting into my sleeping bag, trying to make a pillow out of my backpack and a rolled-up sweater, and then nothing. I must have passed out within a minute. The next thing I remember was a strange dream. My brother and I were sitting in the back of my mom's car. I had no idea where we were headed, but he kept teasing me about a crush I had. I kept asking my mom to tell him to stop, but she remained silent. Then, I suddenly heard the sound of a zipper being pulled. It was incredibly loud. I looked around in my dream, trying to find where the sound was coming from. And then, a terrifying thought hit me. This isn't part of my dream. That's my tent's zipper. I need to wake up. Now, the shift from my dream to reality was jarring. One moment, I was in a sunlit car, and the next, I was lying in my pitch-black tent, heart racing. My first clear thought was, get your gun. Fast. I've put in hours at the shooting range with my firearm. It's just a small 9mm, but it's compact, easy to handle, and reliable. Still, I'd never been in a situation where I thought I might actually have to use it. My firearms instructor always emphasized how real-life adrenaline makes everything harder. And wow, was he right. Even with all my practice, my hands were shaking as I reached for it. Meanwhile, the zipper of my tent was still coming down, slowly and deliberately. That sound, zip, was almost drowned out by the pounding of my heart. Whoever was out there either didn't hear me grabbing my gun or didn't care because they kept unzipping. I probably sounded terrified, but I tried to sound as fierce as possible when I spoke. Get away from my tent if you don't want to die right here. The zipper stopped, but the silence that followed made my blood run cold. Whoever it was hadn't moved. I tightened my grip on my gun and forced my voice to stay steady. I have a weapon pointed at the entrance. If I don't hear you walking away in the next 5 seconds, I'm going to start firing. Then, finally, movement. I heard them stand, take a few slow steps back, and then more quickly as they retreated. I assumed they'd start running. I mean, that's what I would do if someone just threatened to shoot me in the middle of the woods. But they didn't. Instead, they walked away slowly. Their footsteps grew fainter and fainter until nothing. I wasn't sure if they had simply walked far enough away that I couldn't hear them anymore, or if they had stopped just beyond earshot to wait and see what I would do next. The thought paralyzed me. I lay there, gun aimed at the tent entrance, unable to move for what felt like an eternity. Since I was only a few miles into the trail, I still had some spotty cell service, likely from a tower near the highway. I managed to call 911 from my tent. The dispatcher assured me that while they could alert the county sheriff's office, they could also send a couple of park rangers to me on ATVs within about 20 minutes. They told me not to be alarmed if I heard the engines roaring through the forest, and to take that as the sound of my rescue arriving. That was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I lay there in the darkness, listening for any sound of footsteps approaching again. When the rangers finally arrived, I scrambled out of my tent and explained what had happened. They searched the area but didn't find anyone nearby. However, they did find tracks leading away from my campsite, disappearing into the trees. If the person had been waiting for me to let my guard down, they had done so from a distance. That didn't make me feel much better, though. So, I gladly accepted the ranger's offer to ride back to my car and leave that place behind. That was the first and only time anything like that has happened to me. I was shaken up for weeks afterward, and not just because it was terrifying in the moment. I don't know if you've ever been close to pulling the trigger on someone before, and I hope you never have to be. But let me tell you, it's not what you think. I wish I could sit here and tell you I felt powerful, that I was ready to take down some predator in the woods. But I wasn't, and despite all my preparation, I don't think I ever would have been. My instructor had warned me about this. He told me that real life isn't like the movies, where pulling a gun makes the bad guy back off immediately. If you draw your weapon, you have to be ready to use it, because if you hesitate, they could take it from you and turn it against you. And the truth is, I don't know how far I would have let that person go before pulling the trigger. If they had lunged at me, or if I had seen a weapon in their hand, I would have fired. But I also know that before that moment, I probably would have begged them to stop. That night changed the way I look at everything. The self-defense classes I took always talked about neutralizing the threat or ending the danger. But when you're the one holding the gun, staring down the reality of taking a life, it doesn't feel like that at all. It feels like something entirely different, and it's something I hope I never have to experience again.